Don't believe them, Harold. Only believe me, Margaret whispered, her voice trembling, as the choir's hymn echoed through the packed church. I turned to my wife. Candlelight brushed across her face, soft, familiar, but her eyes avoided mine, drifting somewhere beyond the frosted glass window. Outside, the congregation bowed their heads in prayer. In my hand, an unopened envelope trembled as if it were alive. A stranger had handed it to me before the service, saying only one thing: "You should know the truth before you pray." I didn't open it right away. I wanted to believe Margaret. For 40 years, I never doubted her. The woman who helped me build this church, who sang at every wedding, who I thought embodied faith and devotion. But in that moment, as the choir's voices rose, I felt cold sweat slide down my neck. Margaret's hand gripped mine, too tightly, as if she feared I'd let go or open the letter. And I understood. What was collapsing that day wasn't just a marriage, it was the faith I'd spent my entire life building. Don't look away, because what I discovered inside that envelope was crueler than any lie ever spoken. I met Margaret in the summer of 1975, when my hair was still black and I believed that everything good began in a church. That day, the choir was rehearsing early for Christmas. I was a young engineer, hired to repair the church's dome, just planning to stop by for a few minutes. But when I heard the voice of the woman standing in the front row, I froze. In the sunlight, streaming through stained glass, she sang, "Abide with me." Her voice was so pure it made the entire room hold its breath. After rehearsal, I walked up to her. She looked down shyly and smiled. "You're the one fixing the bell tower, right? Be careful, those nails can be slippery," I laughed. "And you should be careful with that voice. It could make people forget about God." Margaret blushed. From that day on, we were never apart. We married in a small ceremony, just candles, white roses, and the same hymn she once sang. When I was chosen to lead the parish, Margaret was the first to volunteer to manage the church's charity fund. She was meticulous, dedicated, and always believed that serving God is the only way to heal the soul. For 40 peaceful years, we lived in a modest house by Franklin Lake. Every Sunday morning, I woke Margaret with the smell of coffee. She'd fix her scarf, I'd grab my Bible, and we'd walk hand in hand down the leaf-covered road to the church, where everyone called us the couple of faith. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Until one winter, when the church roof needed repairs, and Margaret offered to lead the fundraising. Her eyes lit up, with determination, and something I couldn't name. I didn't know it then, but that was the first crack in everything we built. 5 years before everything fell apart, I began to notice that Margaret wasn't the same woman who once sang in the choir with eyes full of light. She was busier, quieter, and she started carrying a cell phone, something she'd never bothered with in decades. Dinner grew silent. She'd eat quickly, then say she had to meet at church about the relief fund. I believed her. I always did. Because to me, faith and marriage didn't need proof, only trust. But then whispers began to spread. A woman from the congregation leaned close one Sunday and murmured, "Father Samuel and Mrs. Margaret seem unusually close. Are they just talking about the charity fund?" I brushed it off. I was furious that anyone would dare slander my wife. But that night, when Margaret came home late, I noticed a strange lipstick stain on her collar. She said it was from a choir sister's goodbye hug. I smiled, but something inside me began to tighten. Months later, the church held its largest fundraiser ever. Margaret oversaw the finances. Father Samuel announced, "Thanks to Mrs. Margaret's devotion, we've raised over $200,000. Applause erupted. I smiled, too, but in Margaret's eyes I saw a flicker, not pride, but fear. From then on, she avoided talking about money, the church, even me. Late at night, I'd hear her whispering on the phone in the living room, her voice small, like a confession. Then one Sunday morning, I received an anonymous text. "If you truly believe in God, read what's inside this envelope today." That afternoon, I attended Mass as usual, but people looked at me differently. Some avoided my gaze, others looked at me with pity. As the hymn began, a stranger walked up and placed a sealed envelope in my hand. Margaret sat right beside me, her smile stiff. I was about to ask, but she lowered her head and whispered, "Don't believe them, Harold. Only believe me." And in that moment, inside the church I once thought was sacred, I knew no prayer I said that day would ever reach heaven again. The service ended in an eerie silence. No one came to shake my hand like they always did. No God bless you on the way out. Just looks, strange ones, somewhere between pity and curiosity. Margaret hurried toward the car, her dress brushing the ground, fingers squeezing the hymnal until her knuckles blanched. I followed, the envelope still tucked in my jacket. I could hear my heartbeat thudding against the fabric like a funeral drum. When the car door shut, I turned to her. Is there anything you want to tell me? She stared straight ahead. Her voice was hoarse. About what? About this envelope. I set it on the dashboard. She didn't touch it, but her shoulders trembled. Don't read it, Harold. They're trying to turn us against each other. Who are they? People who are jealous. They can't stand that you're loved. They can't stand that we're happy. I laughed, dry and brittle. Happy? We haven't had dinner together in a month, Margaret. I don't know where you go after services, and you don't bother to say, if that's happiness, I'm afraid I don't know the new definition. She turned to me, eyes brimming. You doubt me, after 40 years? I doubt myself, for trusting you too much. No one spoke. I opened the envelope, a faintly printed sheet, a few handwritten lines, and photos. Margaret in the church office, Margaret with Father Samuel, heads bent over a stack of files, and finally, Margaret's hand on his shoulder, far too close. My chest tightened, not because the scene was overtly intimate, but because the face in those photos wasn't the Margaret I knew. No light, no gentleness, only worry and concealment. I handed her the paper. Explain. She looked at the pictures and began to cry softly. They set this up. Samuel was just helping me review the ledgers. It was late, the camera's old, the angle's bad. They want you to believe I betrayed you so they can wreck the church's name. You have to trust me, Harold. You have to. Her voice shook, but her gaze wouldn't meet mine. I said nothing. Rain began to drum against the windshield, heavy, deliberate. Margaret touched my hand, ice cold. We've gotten through so much together. Don't let the cruel win. I turned and spoke slowly. If they can fabricate the look in your eyes, then they're truly gifted. She choked back a sob. I started the engine and drove home. For 30 minutes, neither of us said a word. Only the wipers moved, sweeping back and forth as if trying to erase an image I knew would haunt me forever. That night, I sat alone in the living room, staring at our old wedding photo, Margaret in white, eyes bright as stars. I wondered when the woman in that frame had disappeared. 3 days after that service, the church called an emergency meeting about the relief fund. I sat in the committee room among people who once called me our Honorable Harold. Now they avoided eye contact. The whispers were so soft they could have been the wind, but each word pricked like a needle. Heard the donations are off. Has something to do with her. I kept quiet. But that night at home, I opened the steel cabinet where Margaret kept the financial files. I had never done that, never suspected, never searched. I found unfamiliar invoices, transfers to Hope Outreach, St. Mercy Fund, organizations not on our partner list, nearly $60,000 in total. Beside them, receipts tied to an account under the name M. Lewis. Margaret Lewis, her maiden name. I flipped through the papers, heart pounding. On one statement, a note read, Reimbursement, S. Just an S, but I knew exactly who it meant, Samuel. I carried the file to the living room. Margaret sat on the sofa, lamplight catching the dark circles under her eyes. I set the stack down. What's your explanation now? She stared, silent. After a long while, she whispered, You shouldn't have gone through those. That's the congregation's money, Margaret, the trust of hundreds of people. I didn't steal it. I helped Samuel cover a shortfall temporarily. He promised to pay it back. I froze. Temporarily? $60,000 is temporary? She jumped to her feet, voice rising. You don't understand. If this got out, the church would lose credibility. People would lose their faith. I was protecting everything you built. I looked at her and didn't recognize the woman who once prayed beside me every morning. You protected me? By lying to me? Silence. The wall clock ticked, cold and relentless. I gathered the papers, my voice low. I used to think the worst thing would be you betraying my love. Now I know there's something worse. You betrayed our faith. Margaret collapsed into the chair, sobbing. You can hate me, but please don't tell them. Don't let everything fall apart. I studied her for a long time. I no longer saw the gentle woman I'd married. only a lost soul clawing at the last scraps of light. I turned toward the door. I don't know what they'll do to you, Margaret, but I know. God won't be silent. The door clicked shut. Night wind rattled the trees by the lake, scattering invoices across the floor. Those numbers, cold, indifferent, etched themselves into my mind, witnesses to the moment my faith finally died. 3 weeks later, Margaret filed to step back from the choir. She said it was health and workload, but I knew better. That same week, Father Samuel suddenly announced an extended leave due to heart issues. 2 withdrawals, 2 polite exits at the same time, and with that, everything began to boil. That evening, I went to church alone. The air felt heavy. As I stepped inside, the conversation stopped instantly. All eyes turned to me. An older man muttered, "They say Harold knows everything, and he's covering for her." A woman murmured, "He's the parish chair. If the fund's missing money, he can't be innocent." I went numb. I had never felt so alone in the very place I'd given my life to. I forced a smile, though my voice shook. If anyone has questions, I'll answer them before the entire congregation. No one spoke. They just looked away. The next day, I received an urgent summons from the board. In the meeting room, the air was so tense I could hear a pen tapping against the table. Ruth, the chair, didn't mince words. "Mr. Harold, some believe you may have known about the improper withdrawals. Can you explain?" I lifted my head. I knew nothing until I found the records. I've turned everything over to the audit committee. Ruth's tone softened, but her eyes stayed cool. "Even so, as parish chair, responsibility still falls to you, and the fact that Margaret is your wife leads people to believe you may have shielded her." Silence. My heart dropped into a void, a lifetime of service, every dollar, every drop of sweat, reduced to one word: suspicion. That night, I came home to find Margaret sitting in the dark. "They've started the investigation," I said. She nodded without looking up. "I know. Ruth called me. They want me to step away to minimize the damage." "Do you know what else they said?" My hands clenched, my throat tight. "They said I'm an accomplice. That I took the money with you, to dodge taxes, to hide it. Do you understand, Margaret? They're tearing my name to shreds." She trembled, tears pooling in her palms. "I'm sorry. I never thought it would go this far. I only wanted to save Samuel." "Save him? And what about me?" I shot to my feet, my voice cracking. "I've lost everything. The church, my reputation, my faith, because of you." She bowed her head and said nothing. I looked around the house that once rang with laughter, now just the clock ticking out a mournful rhythm. That night, I sat by the window, staring at Franklin Lake. Moonlight skimmed the water like shards of broken glass. From the bedroom came the sound of Margaret's sobs, breaking into rough, dry coughs. And I knew from that night on we were no longer husband and wife. We were 2 lost souls, trapped between guilt and faith. The text arrived on a Monday afternoon, an anonymous link. No caption, just 3 words: "Watch and understand." I clicked. The screen went dark, then a familiar room appeared. The church archive, viewed from a security camera's angle. Margaret and Father Samuel, sitting close, towers of files around them. The slow hum of a fan, the rustle of paper. Samuel spoke softly, but the mic caught every word. "If we confess everything, they'll cut our funding. It'll all come crashing down." Margaret lowered her head, voice shaking. "But it's their money, God's money." Samuel laid a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes you hide a piece of the truth to protect faith. Harold won't understand." Margaret was quiet, then she nodded. "I'm just afraid he'll find out." "I'll handle it. Let this fundraising season pass. After that, we can adjust the books." Then Samuel smiled, a small, chilling smile. Margaret answered with a tired, hopeless look and, God help me, a touch of his hand. The video ended. I sat frozen. My ears rang. My heart plunged. I'd thought people were slandering her. I'd thought maybe she'd been tricked, threatened. But no, she was complicit. She knew everything, and chose silence. I called Margaret. She didn't pick up. 10 minutes later, she walked in to find me at the table, laptop open, the video paused on the frame of their hands touching. Harold, she gasped, panicked. Who sent that to you? It doesn't matter who sent it. What matters is what I saw. She stepped closer, tears spilling. It's not what you think. Samuel said if we told the truth, the whole parish would collapse. I was trying to protect you, protect everyone. I laughed, not bitter this time, but hollow. Protect me? By betraying God? Margaret dropped to her knees and clutched at my legs. I'm sorry, Harold. I only wanted to preserve their belief. You always said faith is what saves us. I was afraid if we lost it, you'd fall apart. I gently loosened her grip. You're wrong. Faith doesn't die because of truth. It dies because of lies. She broke down, sobbing. I stepped back out of tears. Evening light poured through the window, washing over our wedding photo, two young faces smiling in a garden of white flowers. I looked into those eyes, then at the woman kneeling before me. She was no longer the Margaret of 1975. She was a soul that had traded the light for a counterfeit peace. That night, I went to the church one last time. Inside, the lights were dim, the pews empty. I knelt in the back and tried to pray. But the harder I tried to speak to God, the more I felt the hollow widen. My prayers didn't rise. They fell, heavy as ash. And I knew. That night, my faith died with the love I once had for a woman. The board chose Thursday night for the Transparency Forum. The hall was packed. The fluorescent lights were too white, making everyone look waxy and pale. Rows of chairs stretched to the back wall, where a wooden cross hung alone. I sat in the front row, a heavy folder wedged under my arm. Statements, invoices, footage pulls. The old wood, the damp raincoats, the tight metallic scent of tension. Together they made the air feel more suffocating than any courtroom. Ruth opened. We're here to find the truth. She let her eyes settle on me a beat longer. Mr. Harold, please. I stood. My knees popped, not from 65, but from a heart pounding against bone. I dropped the folder onto the lectern. The thud sounded like a sentence falling on my own head. I'll be brief, I began. Hundreds of eyes swung toward me. There were withdrawals made outside proper procedure, total $60,000. The sign-off reads M. Lewis. The reimbursements are noted with the letter S. You all know who M. Lewis is. A murmur rippled across the room. I didn't turn, but I heard someone swallow. I've given copies to the audit committee. This is the archive security footage. I held up a USB and plugged it into the projector. The screen flickered, then steadied. Margaret and Samuel surrounded by files. Their voices, hide a piece of the truth, adjust the books. Harold won't understand, came through clearly. I didn't look at the screen. I already knew every breath by heart. When the final frame froze on their hands touching, the hall fell silent. Not prayerful silence. Blade slice silence. We don't die from sin, I said. We die from pretending we don't see it. A tall man shot up. How long have you known? Since I opened the letter. Since I looked into my wife's eyes and saw no light, I answered. Whispers rose. A young woman asked, voice shaking, So, Margaret and Father Samuel, I'm not talking about flesh, I cut in. I'm talking about another betrayal, of faith, using people's belief to cover a hole. As I stepped down, my legs felt weightless, as if I wasn't touching the floor. I thought the storm had passed. I was wrong. The crest had only begun to rise, because in the middle rows, Margaret stood, wiped her tears, straightened her scarf, and turned to the room. When she spoke, her voice was so clear it resurrected years of choir practice. My turn, she said. Yeah, and I'll say what Harold didn't. People sank back into their seats. Heads leaned together. In their eyes I saw what I had to learn to endure tonight. Curiosity braided with judgment, the most combustible mix in any sanctuary. Margaret walked to the lectern the way she used to step up to lead the choir. Only now there was no sheet music to cling to. She placed her hands on the edge, looked at everyone, then at me, longer than usual, long enough to make me want to look away. I won't deny the clip, she began. 100 heartbeats stuttered at once. But the context was cut. The room buzzed on cue. A young man in the last row called out, Cut how? We heard everything. Margaret didn't rush. She pulled out a stack of papers. This year, The emergency aid fund ran short because the main grant was delayed. Father Samuel used personal money up front for several medical cases. I, as the fund manager, rebalanced temporarily so no one would be left stranded. We intended to true it up after the fundraising season. She lifted her gaze, dropped each word like a weight. I broke procedure. I did not steal. A scoff popped from a corner. Ruth's voice was low. Why didn't you inform the board? Because I was afraid, Margaret said, smaller now. Afraid you'd slash the programs keeping people alive. I was afraid everything Harold built would collapse. I wanted to protect us. She turned to me. For a flicker, I saw the eyes from 1975, clear and proud. Then the fog of the present smothered them. And Harold won't understand, someone snapped. Because he's principled, she said. A principled man will lock the doors to avoid breaking a rule, even if someone is freezing to death outside. I chose to open the door first, then apologize later. That's the difference. Some nodded. Some shook their heads. An elderly woman stood, leaning on her cane. Mrs. Margaret, I received money for my medicine last month. Without it, Her voice caught. The room tilted with the unfinished sentence. I gripped the chair edge. Faith isn't opening the safe and apologizing later, I said, keeping my tone level. Faith is doing what's right, even when it costs. Margaret looked at me, her mouth unsteady. What's right can't be stone, Harold. Sometimes the honest have to wade into the mud to pull someone out. The youth group leader, mid-40s, clapped twice, alone. A few scattered claps followed, not a round of applause, just enough to throw a pail of cold water on my chest. Margaret lowered her head. As for the clip, the hand on the hand, I was wrong. I was weak. When someone shoulders a piece of your fear, it's easy to slip. But I never betrayed our marriage in the flesh. Faith is betrayed before flesh, I said quietly, and it hurts more. The room splintered into pieces. One side turned toward me. Harold's right. Rules are rules. The other turned toward Margaret. She helped people. The divide raced like fire along dry cracks. Young versus old, recipients versus donors, hearts versus forms. Ruth banged the gavel. Order. The audit committee will determine the findings. Tonight is for listening. But words like accomplice, performative mercy, rigid and cold, hypocrite, were already out, and words once released are bullets. They don't come back. Margaret finished. I'm willing to step back from everything while we wait, but please don't bury a lifetime of service with a clipped video. She looked at me one last time. If someone must be punished, let it be me. But don't shred Harold's honor. The line cut both ways, shield and accusation. Heads tilted together again. I felt myself drifting backward inside my own body, as if watching me from a distance. I thought I was on empty. Then a hand went up. Ethan, the former addict the church fund helped into recovery. His face was thin, his eyes deep, but his voice was steady. If not for Mrs. Margaret, I wouldn't be alive to speak. But if people's money was misused, I won't keep quiet either. I owe both of you the truth. The room fell silent. For once, both sides listened to someone from the margins. And I understood. This fight would not come in black and white. It would ask for blood. The blood of honor, of love, of everything we thought was unshakable. The meeting broke into chaos. No handshakes. No God be with you at the doors. People streamed into the lot, umbrellas popping open like black mushrooms. The first real storm rain hammered the tin roof. I stood beneath the eave, my folder bleeding dark at the corners. Ethan came over. Mr. Harold, can we talk a second? I nodded. We tucked in by a wooden post. He said simply, I'm for the right thing. But the way you spoke tonight, it made folks feel like you were putting her on trial instead of the facts. I'm afraid they'll turn their backs. I thanked him. A man who's been to the bottom speaks with a different weight. He dashed into the rain, leaving me with water slamming the worn steps. Far off, Margaret stood beneath an old maple. No one approached her. Samuel never showed. People who used to cluster around her after choir glanced past and quickened their pace. My heart was both soft and hard. Soft for a soul shivering alone. Hard because every choice carries a price. Ruth stepped toward me, closing her umbrella, rain sliding down her sleeves. The committee will suspend you both from all roles pending an independent audit, she said. I hope you'll... She paused, choosing. Refrain from speaking to the press. The press? I asked, dazed as if waking from a spell. There are 3 reporters outside, she said. Someone sent the clip. I shut my eyes. A chill stabbed down my spine. Rumor turns into a system. A system hardens into public opinion. I knew that mechanism better than anyone. Once the church's defender of reputation, I knew one headline could crush 40 years of service. I stepped into the rain. 3 microphones pecked toward me like birds after grain. Mr. Harold, did your wife embezzle? Were you complicit? Do you feel betrayed? I said one line, loud enough to last a lifetime. Faith doesn't die from sin. It dies when we pretend not to see it. Then I walked away. Nothing more. On the drive home, the windshield flooded so fast the wipers ran at full tilt. Brake lights ahead blurred and sharpened like 2 embers sinking and rising. At a red light, I looked in the rear view, a man whose eyes didn't recognize himself. I thought of our kitchen, the oak table scarred by Christmas baking. I thought of Margaret's hand over mine through thousands of evening prayers. All of it receded like a film slipping off its reel. Back home, I hung my raincoat and stood still. The house smelled damp and faintly of cinnamon. On the table, a steaming cup of tea. Margaret had beaten me there. She sat across from it, hands wrapped tight around the mug like it was the last warm thing left. "Did you have to say it like that?" she asked, voice thin as mist. "I told the truth," I said. I heard myself use I, not I, your husband. A gulf, just one pronoun wide, and deep as a chasm. She closed her eyes. "I accept the suspension. I'll answer every question. But I'm asking one thing. Don't let your anger destroy the church." I looked at her slowly. "I'm not angry about losing a title. I'm angry you used protecting me to step on God's law." She trembled. "Then, will you still stand by me?" I turned to the window. Rain drove straight down into Franklin Lake, leaves plastered into dark mats. "No one stands by anyone when standing before justice," I said. "In the morning, my attorney will contact the committee." She set the cup down. The click of porcelain on wood sounded like dry bone. "So that's it," she said, not asking, reading a verdict. I went into the study and closed the door. The downpour became a heavy curtain, muffling the world. I opened my Bible, my finger finding the familiar line. "The truth will set you free." I read it again and again until the letters blurred. But that night, I didn't feel free. I saw only a battlefield I had to cross. Because if I stopped, everything I believed would curdle into a joke. In the other room, Margaret cried, choked, then silent. Somewhere, the clock struck 12. A new day began with a declaration of war. Between me and her, between us and the rest of the parish, between law and mercy. And I knew this first counterstrike was only the prelude. Once it's public, the legal will follow, the public will tear, and in the end, the court will collect the debt we owe the truth. The morning after the storm, I walked into Attorney Arthur Kane's office, a salt and pepper man with steel-gray eyes, famous for 3 words, no compromises. On his wall hung a single frame. Truth doesn't need to be liked, only proven. I sat and set the folder in front of him. Statements, invoices, a USB with the clip, the suspension notice, and a handwritten page listing the exact dates and times I'd found irregularities. Arthur listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked, blunt as a gavel, "What do you want, Harold? Justice or revenge?" "Justice," I said, "and I want no one else to pay for our silence." He nodded, rang for his assistant. "File an emergency motion to freeze all accounts tied to the relief fund, demand an independent forensic audit, and Harold, no press comments without me from now on." I signed the power of attorney. Each stroke of the pen felt heavy and final, like nailing shut a door we'd always hoped to keep labeled, "Handle it internally." We'd crossed that line. By noon, the board received a court order, temporary freeze on 2 primary fund accounts, immediate turnover of ledgers, vouchers, emails, the key log for the archive room. Ruth called, a trace of worry in her voice. "Harold, this will trigger a PR crisis." "It already has," I said. "At least now it'll follow due process." That afternoon, Margaret texted me one line. "I told the board I'll take responsibility for procedural errors. Please don't drag our family into litigation." I replied, "This was never a family matter. It's a matter of the community's faith." Arthur's audit team arrived at the church in white shirts, scanners in hand, cracking open carton after carton like tombs, old, dusty, but the numbers had nowhere to hide. I stood in the hall, watching through the glass. Inside, the church accountant, Linda, signed the handover with shaking hands. She whispered, "I never thought it would come to this." "No one ever does," I said, "but that doesn't mean it didn't." By day's end, Arthur slid a list across to me. 14 temporary rebalances with no board resolution, 5 reimbursements flagged with S, 1 internal email from Samuel to Margaret. After Advent, we'll adjust back. Arthur said, "Here's the pivot. No proof of theft, but clear intent to conceal. We'll build on breach of fiduciary duty and governance failures. Courts care more about process than feelings." I got home at dusk. The front door was ajar. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, a small suitcase by her chair. Her voice was worn down to gravel. "I'll stay with my sister a few days. Reporters won't leave the gate." "Okay." She stood, took a step toward me, then stopped, caught between 2 invisible walls, guilt and pride. "Are you still—" She couldn't finish. "Arthur will speak to your lawyer," I cut in. "Let the law talk to the law, people to people. That's hard right now." When the door clicked shut behind her, the house made a small sound that thundered in my chest. I sat, opened my Bible, touched the old verse, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." I didn't feel filled. I felt a different hunger coming on, one that gnaws to the bone, hunger for the whole truth. 3 days after the freeze, Arthur walked into my office with a folded newspaper. The front page screamed, "Wife of Parish Chair accuses husband of psychological abuse and religious power play." Below it, Margaret's photo, pale face, swollen eyes, stood beside a man in a black suit, attorney Paul DeWitt, former Franklin County prosecutor turned civil litigator. Arthur tossed the paper on my desk. "I told you to avoid the media." "Looks like the other side didn't get that memo." I read the lines. Margaret claimed severe emotional pressure, that I'd monitored and threatened litigation, that I froze accounts without board consent, and denied her a fair chance to defend herself. I sat for a long moment. "They'll believe her," Arthur shrugged. "Reporters prefer tears to evidence. Fortunately for us, feelings can't replace proof." By late afternoon, Paul filed a formal counter-complaint, asking the court to review my abuse of authority in church governance and demanding damages for Margaret's reputation. At the same time, the board received a petition to lift the freeze due to harm to emergency charity operations. The legal thunder rolled in fast. Arthur skimmed the filings and smirked. "Textbook tactic. They know we have receipts, so they'll attack the process, flip you from accuser to accused." I exhaled. "She's killing the very thing she once prayed to protect." Arthur didn't answer. He held up another document. "This might complicate things." It was the audit team's preliminary report. In hundreds of reviewed transactions, they found a $10,000 transfer from the relief fund to the Franklin Building Fund, which I chaired. I went cold. "That's impossible. I never authorized money from that fund." Arthur's look was a knife. "I believe you. The court won't. 2 possibilities: accounting error, or someone used your name to balance the books." I flipped the file. The signature looked exactly like mine, clean enough to pass an initial check. "Who can sign in my stead?" "The deputy treasurer. She says she signed after an approval email from you." "That email exists." Arthur set a hand on my shoulder. "We're being hit on 2 fronts, press and forged paperwork, both aimed at your honor." I stared out at the first snow dusting the church roof. The cold didn't seep in from outside. It radiated from within. "If they plan to make me the scapegoat to save themselves, Arthur, then we move faster. Tonight I'll subpoena server logs. If someone spoofed your signature or email, the trail will show." I nodded, but inside me another ache sparked to life. Not because I was accused, but because the person filing the accusation once held my hand every Sunday night, asking God to keep our family whole. 3 nights later, Arthur called near midnight. His voice was hoarse, hard as steel. "Get to the office. We just found the devil's fingerprint." I threw on a coat and drove into the cold. The audit team crowded around a large screen, scrolling through server logs. A technician pointed at a block of metadata. "Here's the transfer approval email with Mr. Harold's digital signature, but the IP doesn't match. This came from a different device, inside the finance office, March 14th, 9:37 p.m. I remembered that night. I wasn't there. I was at the hospital, visiting Margaret after she'd said she felt unwell post-service. Arthur ground his teeth. Where was she at 9:37? In a hospital bed, I said. At least that's what I thought. Security records showed otherwise. Margaret's keycard was used at the office at 9:15 p.m. Minutes later, the forged email went out. Arthur drummed the table. So someone used your credentials to plug a hole, and only two people knew your approval password. You and your wife. I stood there, hollowed out. The shards fit together. The counterclaim, the emotional abuse headline, the fake email, the relief fund, one chessboard, and I'd been positioned for checkmate from the start. Arthur squeezed my shoulder. We still have a shot. The system stores device fingerprints. Give me 24 hours. If they match Margaret's machine, this flips the whole case. The emergency hearing the next morning felt like the air before a tornado. Reporters clogged the hallway. Margaret sat across the aisle, chalk white, beside Paul DeWitt, calm as a man who knows where the blade is and how to use it. Arthur opened with iron in his voice. Your Honor, my client stands accused of abuse of power and psychological harm. We have clear evidence the approval email was forged. The digital fingerprint matches a device assigned to Mrs. Margaret Lewis, Mr. Harold's wife. The courtroom erupted. Paul shot to his feet. Objection? The evidence hasn't been authenticated. Arthur slid a USB onto the table. The church's security is managed by an independent contractor with notarized validation. If the defense disputes it, we request immediate forensic access to Mrs. Lewis's devices for cross-verification. Paul had no clean retort. Margaret bowed her head, hands knotted so tight her nails broke skin. A bead of blood welled, and still she didn't pull away. The judge rapped the bench. Counter-complaint by Mrs. Margaret Lewis is hereby stayed. The matter of forgery of financial approvals is referred to independent investigation. Gasps rippled. Reporters spilled into the corridor, shouting into phones. Arthur sat and looked at me. You see, truth fights for itself, if we don't quit before it can speak. I didn't answer. I looked at Margaret. She wouldn't look back. She wiped her eyes and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, I wanted to save you, Harold, and I killed the very thing you believe in. I didn't respond. I lowered my head. Outside, Franklin's church bell tolled the noon hour, no longer a blessing, but a verdict ringing over two souls who once swore to live and die by faith. Monday morning, I opened the door to a black fence of microphones. Spears pointed at my chest. The first chill wind carried a frenzy of shutter clicks. A reporter held up a phone, its screen frozen on the archive room, Margaret's hand on Samuel's shoulder. They'd trimmed the clip, kept Harold Won't Understand, hide a piece of the truth, cut the dry minutes of numbers and ledgers. Only feeling remained, swelling like a fire. Across social media, two hashtags erupted. #Stand with Margaret and #Faith Not Fraud. One side called her a woman crushed by the system. The other called me a cold keeper of the faith. I read the comments, each word a thrown stone. He's jealous and lawyering up for revenge. She saves lives. He keeps rules so people freeze. A hypocrite in a parish chair. Don't launder money with kindness. At noon, the local station asked for a live interview. Arthur shook his head. I said yes. I'd learned to avoid microphones, but ducking won't save the truth once it's been edited. The host opened with a hook. Mr. Harold, your wife says you psychologically abused her. Did you belittle, control, or threaten her? I'm not perfect, I said. Some days I'm drier than my prayers. But I've never used faith to force anyone to do wrong, and I've never used marriage as a leash. They played the clip again, then cut to Margaret from a pre-taped segment, red eyes, cracked voice. I only wanted to warm shaking hands. In the studio, someone dabbed at tears. The host turned back. Do you think you're too rigid? Rules are door frames, I said. If you smash the frame because you fear the cold, the house stops being a house. Silence. I knew I'd lost the round on air. The answer was right, but it didn't play. Media doesn't feed on truth. It feeds on feeling. And tonight, feeling belonged to Margaret. After dark, candles appeared at my gate. A small crowd, mostly young, held signs. Forgiveness over punishment. They sang Amazing Grace in hushed voices. I stood behind the curtain and listened. I once was lost, but now am found. I wondered who was lost, and who was found. My phone buzzed. Ethan, I'm going live to tell the truth about how the fund saved me and why process matters. You should join, but don't attack her. I typed back, I'll listen, tonight. On the other screen, the feeling war kept burning. I realized, public opinion doesn't stab with knives. It scores the scene with music. Whoever owns the soundtrack wins, even if the notes are wrong. Ethan chose an empty room at the recovery center. White walls, soft amber light, a wooden chair. He sat tall, jawbone sharp, eyes hollow but alert. Viewers climbed from 200 to 7,000 to 15,000. Hi, he said. I'm the guy who stole from his mom, pawned the furniture, and begged the church for a place to sleep. I'm the person you don't want to meet in the park at night. And the relief fund, managed by Mrs. Margaret, overseen by Mr. Harold, saved me. Comments poured like a flood. Respect. Let him speak. Don't be bought. He told them about cold nights, hot soup, volunteers who listened to the shakes without judgment. I owe Mrs. Margaret my life, he said, eyes bright. But if helping me means someone cut corners, skipped controls, who protects the fun tomorrow from the old me coming back to take? He waved me into frame. I sat beside him. No tie, no pin. I let love put my faith to sleep, I said. I thought the only way to keep a house is to lock the door at night, even when the wind howls. Margaret thought you open the door first, even if the lock breaks. We both forgot a third thing. Locks can be oiled and fixed. You don't have to smash them. The chat slowed. A user asked, if the court proves she faked the email, will you still forgive her? I looked into the lens. Forgiveness is God's command to me. Consequences are justice's command to everyone. They don't cancel each other. Ethan tapped the table, little wood metronome. He spoke about group therapy, learning to say I was wrong, without adding but. I want Mrs. Margaret to have the chance to say I was wrong with no but, he said, and I want Mr. Harold to say I'm hurt without so she must pay. Viewers crossed 40,000. Newsrooms began clipping the stream. A reporter texted me, this is the conversation that matters. When the live ended, Ethan sagged against the wall, breathing hard. They'll drag me into the storm, he said. You've been in the storm a long time, I said. The difference is, you stand upright now. That night, a quieter wave rose. Hashed, fix the lock. Not as loud as the first two, but steady. People started talking about process not as the enemy of compassion, but as its armor. For the first time, public opinion didn't stand with a person. It stood with an idea. Warm the cold without burning down the house. A week later, the board held an open dialogue in the small square by the church. No dais, no gavel, just microphones, plastic chairs, and a large borrowed clock to remind everyone to keep to time. 3 news cameras. Neighbors lined both sides. Margaret arrived in a dark dress, face strangely calm. Paul hovered at her elbow, eyes locked on his phone. When she took the mic, the square softened. I'm not here to make excuses, she said. I'm here to speak without the word but. She told them about blanket lines at midnight, emergency surgeries that needed bridge money, phone calls at 2 a.m. I chose to skirt the books, she said, voice clear. I was wrong. I thought I could save people without process. I forgot process also saves people, saves them from a heart like mine that can slip. The square rippled. Paul frowned but stayed quiet. As for the forged email, I'll answer in court, she added. Here, I want to say one thing to Harold. I used your name to plug one hole. I carved a bigger one in you. I stood and took the mic. Wind flicked the program sheet in my hand. I thought keeping the rules was enough, I said. Tonight I learned something else. Keeping people is a rule, too. I turned to the crowd. If all we do after this is swap managers without changing management, we'll get lost again. A young man raised his hand. So what do we do? Rebuild transparent processes so donors and recipients can see the same flow, I said. Create an independent council, including people who've received help, like Ethan, so no one can hide behind good intentions. The applause this time wasn't scattered. It was full, even, not pity, but the sound of a concrete promise. Ruth stepped forward and announced, in 30 days the board will launch an open data portal for the fund. Every deposit and expense, every digital signature, every vault access, time-stamped. And the church bell only rings on time if the clock is set right. Tonight we start setting it. Behind us, Franklin's bell struck 6. For the first time in weeks, it didn't sound like judgment. It sounded like a schedule, clear, timed, accountable. When the crowd thinned, Margaret approached. We stood one breath apart. "Thank you," she said. "I haven't forgiven you," I answered, honest, "but I'm learning not to turn justice into a knife." She nodded. "I don't deserve forgiveness yet," she said, "but I'll deserve the consequences." We were quiet. The wind carried the smell of dry leaves and iron from the fence. Ethan passed by, lifted a small fist. "The lock, we oil it. We don't smash it." We both smiled, thin as a paper edge, but unbroken. That night, the headlines were less sharp. People shared the line about the lock. Community groups posted the transparency portal link. The crowd stopped being a pack of wolves and started to sound like a town learning to speak slower, and on time. In a house gone cold without a wife's presence, I lit a small candle and set it on the windowsill. Not to cheer aside, just to remind myself, real light doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be turned on, at the right place, at the right time. March. The snow had melted, but the city still breathed cold. On the day of the hearing, Franklin County Court was packed. Cameras were set up by 6 a.m. Parishioners lined the halls, some clutching Bibles like talismans. I walked into the courtroom and saw Margaret across the aisle. Dark dress, black scarf, a pale, drawn face. Beside her sat Paul, her attorney, stone-faced. Arthur leaned toward me. "Stay steady. Today, justice speaks, not feelings." Judge Daniels, tall with a receding hairline, once a member of our parish, opened in a gravelly baritone. "The Franklin Court will hear the matter of breach of trust and financial document forgery between plaintiff Harold Lewis and defendant Margaret Lewis." When he finished, the room held its breath. No one wanted to be the first to move. Arthur rose, voice clear. "Your Honor, this is not simply a dispute between two individuals. It's a story of trust exploited. We will show that the defendant, Mrs. Margaret Lewis, without authorization moved a substantial sum from the Franklin Church Relief Fund to mask a shortfall created by Father Samuel." He laid a stack of exhibits on the table, spreading them like cards. Dates, signatures, transaction codes. Paul stood at once. "Objection. My client acted under emergency circumstances, not for personal gain. There is no evidence she benefited." The judge nodded. "Noted. Proceed with witnesses." Arthur called the first, Linda Rowe, the church accountant, thin, hands laced tight, voice trembling, but every word landed like a stone. "I oversee the relief fund's cash flow. Last October, I discovered a gap between reported donations and the bank deposits. When I asked Father Samuel, he said Mrs. Margaret is handling a temporary adjustment." "Were you asked to record that temporary adjustment?" Arthur asked. "No. Father Samuel told me not to, because everything would be restored after the fundraiser." Arthur presented an exhibit, a $30,000 transfer from the relief fund to a church subaccount, signed by Margaret, with a note. "Pastoral Coordination, Franklin Fund." Linda confirmed the handwriting. Paul pressed back. "Miss Rowe, are you certain my client wasn't following Father Samuel's directive?" "I don't know," Linda said, looking him straight on. "But the signature is hers, and the money moved." Murmurs rippled. Faces that had defended Margaret began to tilt downward. Arthur continued. "Your Honor, this is one of 5 such transfers. All occurred during the period when Father Samuel was flagged for internal accounting irregularities. Each time one person signs off, Margaret Lewis." Paul frowned. "The defendant may have acted under pressure or misplaced trust. We asked to compel Father Samuel." The judge agreed. When his name echoed through the room, a fresh wave of noise. Samuel entered, not a priest anymore, hair silver, shoulders hunched, eyes exhausted. He bowed to the judge, then glanced at Margaret. That look chilled me, not hatred, but something like remorse. "Arthur, Father Samuel, do you admit receiving relief fund money routed through Mrs. Margaret Lewis?" Samuel lifted those Winterlake eyes. "Yes, but I did not use it for myself. I used it to fill a hole I caused in the pastoral fund. I accept responsibility." The clerk's pen flew. Margaret lowered her head, her hands clenched, her lips trembled without sound. Arthur pressed on. "Did you mislead the board, claiming all was fine to keep your position?" "I did," Samuel said, "but I did not coerce Mrs. Lewis. I only said that if the truth got out, Harold would lose his reputation." A collective gasp. He'd used my name to scare her. The judge rapped his gavel. Order. We'll recess 10 minutes before Mrs. Margaret Lewis's testimony. I looked over. Margaret sat motionless, tears sliding unchecked. For the first time, I didn't see a betrayer. I saw a woman dissolving between light and shadow. When the gavel fell silent, the room felt frozen in place. Margaret took the stand. Paul offered an arm. She gently brushed it aside. Small gesture, old pride. Her heels clicked dryly on the floor. The courtroom lights caught the faint silver edge of her black scarf, making her look like a breathing wax figure. Judge Daniels asked, Mrs. Lewis, do you swear to answer truthfully, even if it harms your case? Yes, Your Honor, she said, voice shaky but steady. Arthur stood. His tone lost its usual edge, low and even, the way you speak to someone you used to know. Mrs. Lewis, we've seen the transfers, heard Ms. Rowe, and heard Father Samuel. Do you confirm you executed those transactions? A long silence. Her hands blanched white. Then she nodded. Yes, I did. Small words, but they rang in that big room like a funeral bell. Why? Arthur asked. Personal gain, or for someone else? She drew a deep breath. Not for me. For him. She turned toward the back row, where Samuel sat, head bowed, fingers crushing a small crucifix. In 1989, when the church caught fire, I was trapped by smoke in the archive room. He dragged me out. I owe him my life. After that, whenever he asked for help, I didn't know how to say no. I thought God would understand gratitude. Her voice broke. But I was wrong. I traded conscience for debt. I let gratitude hide a lie. Arthur nodded gently. Do you understand your actions cost Mr. Harold, the husband and parish chair, his reputation, and branded him complicit? I know, she said, choking, and I deserve it. But I thought if the truth came out, everything he built would shatter. I only wanted to protect him. Father Samuel? Arthur asked. She shook her head, tears falling. No, I mean Harold. I wanted to protect my husband. I couldn't bear them saying he failed, that he couldn't lead. I thought I was saving his honor, and I killed it. She wept. I only wanted to protect the man who once saved me. A soft sob somewhere in the gallery. Even Paul said nothing. Time slowed. Each of her tears sank into the wood like blood into earth. Arthur asked quietly, Were you coerced, or did you profit in any way? No, not a cent. It all went to Samuel's fund, but I knew hiding it was wrong. I was just afraid. The judge studied her, then asked, Mrs. Lewis, is there anything you wish to say to Mr. Harold Lewis before the court deliberates? Margaret turned to me. The room emptied of sound. No pens, no coughing, just the breath of two people who once were everything to each other. She said softly, Harold, I believed honesty would wound you, so I lied to protect you. I forgot lies can kill. I killed the best part of you. I looked at her. No anger left, just a wide, airless space inside me, like a house with all the oxygen drawn out. I nodded. I said nothing. At this point, guilt knows how to confess without words. Judge Daniels struck the gavel 3 times. The whole room rose, not by protocol but by instinct. Everyone knew the moment had come. He read slowly, each word heavier than the last. Based on the evidence, the testimony of Mrs. Linda Rowe and Mr. Samuel, and the defendant's admission, the court finds, Mrs. Margaret Lewis is guilty of breach of trust under Section 312 of the Franklin Civil Code. The court notes she did not personally profit and acted under a misguided intent to protect the organization's and others' reputation. Sentence, 18 months suspended, plus 150 hours of community service. Whispers, a few tears, a few nods, measured, not harsh, not soft. He turned to me. As to the plaintiff, Mr. Harold Lewis is fully exonerated. The Franklin Relief Fund may resume operations under new oversight. I bowed my head. Not out of joy, I simply didn't know what else I had the strength to stand for. Daniels laid the gavel down, voice gentler, like a father to 2 lost children. May you both understand, faith cannot live without truth. Faith is not shielding each other from consequence. It is standing together under the light. The final gavel fell. Court adjourned. In the corridor, the crowd pressed in. Flashbulbs popped. Arthur tugged me through the knot of reporters. I stopped when I saw Margaret on the courthouse steps. No one surrounded her. No questions. She stood alone, holding the old Bible I'd given her on our 40th anniversary. I walked over. She looked up, eyes red, strangely calm. "So, it's done?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Justice has spoken." She nodded, glanced at the thinning press. "Do you hate me?" "Hate is keeping someone in your heart to punish them," I said. "I'm tired." She gave a faint, smoky smile. "Then you've forgiven me." "No, Margaret. Forgiveness is letting the other person go. I'm letting myself go." Tears came, unhidden. "I'll do every hour of service. They assigned me to clean the old church library." I looked at her. "Where we met." "Yes," she said. "God has a sense of humor." We stood in quiet. A gust scattered a few stray copies of the Judgment. I bent, picked one up for her. The line was bold, no intent for personal gain, offense born of misdirected loyalty. I read it, then said softly, "Maybe our whole lives we've been loyal in the wrong direction, toward people, toward rules, even toward God." She gripped the Bible. "At least today I told the truth in the right direction." She turned and stepped into the noon light, small against the cold sun. I didn't call after her. What would be the point, when all that remained between us was the echo of words that came too late? Arthur touched my shoulder. "You won," he said. I gave a thin smile, eyes far away. "No, Arthur, I just stood on the side of justice. That side is cold." He was quiet, then murmured, "Sometimes God doesn't let us win to celebrate. He lets us win to remember." That afternoon I went back to the church. The wooden doors were open, warm light spilled across empty pews. I sat in the last row and looked up at the silent cross. No one spoke to me. No apologies, no congratulations. Only wind slipping through stained glass, laying bands of purple, green, red across the floor, beautiful scars the church would carry for life. I bowed my head and, for the first time in months, asked for nothing. I only said, "Thank you for letting truth prevail, and keep her soul. She lost today in the most honest way she could." Franklin's bell tolled, low, slow, clear. I closed my eyes. There was no triumph in this victory, only the quiet of a man who crossed a deep ravine and is still breathing. The verdict had barely settled when Franklin woke to a morning without the old Margaret. Her name disappeared from the choir roster. Her photo, the tilted smile in the front row, was taken down from the church tea room, slipped into a cardboard box, and taped shut in a hurry. The old "God bless yous" turned into flat nods, or worse, faces turned away. It wasn't the quiet of prayer, it was a wall with no door. After court, Margaret moved into her sister's upstairs room, the one that once stored Christmas decorations. The window looked over a narrow lane sloping toward Franklin Lake. This time of year the wind carried honeysuckle and the iron tang of a wet fence. Each morning she tied her hair with a black band, pulled on a dark sweater, and went down to the kitchen after everyone had left for work. On the table, a note from her sister. "Food's in the pot. Don't turn on the TV." Not because of the power bill, because turning it on turned on the crowd. Her phone stayed quiet, except for texts from Paul, her attorney, scattered and clinical, like boot steps in a hospital hall. "Community service starts Monday. Be on time," or "Interview request from X, decline." Once he asked, "Do you want to sell your story for $5,000? She stared at the screen for a long time, then typed, "No." 5,000 could cover part of the meds for the seniors whose shoe sizes she still remembered. But selling the story meant selling the last thing she still owned, the right to speak truth in her own voice. On Monday, she reported to the old church library to start her 150 hours. The court assigned her to clean and catalog pastoral archives. The metal door was heavy, the hinges squealed. Dust and damp paper rushed her face. In this threshold, 20 years ago, a man had dragged her out of smoke, set his hand on her chest, and said, "Breathe with me." She used to believe a life given back its rhythm becomes a debt you can never repay. Today she knew. The one debt you can't pay with money cannot be paid with a lie, either. The work was repetitive. Bend, stack, label, log. Every spine she touched felt like a pulse from the past. Names of families who slipped away from the parish in shame. Names of people who got a hot meal in December. Names of young men who once heard her sing and cried in silence. In a corner, an open box. Damp invoices curling. She pulled on gloves, used a cool dryer, rescued each sheet. The numbers dried, black, cold. She whispered, "I'm sorry." She didn't know to whom, God, Harold, or herself. At lunch, she sat on the library steps, holding a cold sandwich, hands shaking from the wind. A group passed, faces that used to call her Miss Margaret every Wednesday night, suddenly very good at looking across the street. She didn't blame them. People forgive strangers sooner than they forgive those they once trusted. Forgiving family is construction work. Not everyone has the time or strength to build. That afternoon, a shadow paused. Linda Rowe, the church accountant. Linda clutched a ledger. I brought back some old receipts. Didn't want them lost. Margaret stood to help, and Linda pulled back by reflex. They both froze, awkward. Then Linda sighed and held out the stack. I don't hate you. 4 small words, but Margaret felt ground under feet that had been slipping for months. Thank you, she said, eyes down, afraid tears would blot the paper. Back home, the kitchen was cold, dishes already stacked. Margaret ate a little, washed, dried. She opened her Bible and tried to read a short passage, but the words slid off the lines and bumped into each other. Before bed, she called, her own voicemail. She played old choir practice notes she'd once sent the altos. Don't push the breath on beat 3. She laughed softly. It sounded like an over-tight string. On the 3rd day, an unmarked envelope slid under the library door. 2 tickets to the town concert and a note. Keep singing. She looked around. Empty windows, a quiet hallway. The slanted handwriting was unfamiliar. She filed the tickets in a drawer, too afraid to open them. Keep singing. A blessing and a judgment. Sing, but for whom and for what? That evening she walked the lake path. The town was still. The water caught bits of light. The wind smelled of mud. She stopped where she and Harold had counted stars at 30. They used to think life was a song. Hit the right key and it would be beautiful. Now she knew. Key isn't enough. Timing is. She'd been off the beat too long. A car slowed a few yards away. The window lowered. A young woman leaned out. Mrs. Margaret? Margaret nodded. Thank you for that advance. Without it, my baby wouldn't have made it. The window lifted. The car pulled away, as if the driver feared being seen thanking a name people weren't supposed to say. Margaret stood there, eyes burning. She didn't clutch the thanks to excuse herself. She held it to remember. Kindness needs discipline, too. Wind tapped the glass that night like someone calling. She switched on a lamp, spread blank pages on the table. A personal restitution list, not money, but hours. Each name, 5 hours of service, rides to appointments, help with paperwork, reading lessons for elders, voice lessons for kids. The first line, Ethan, 5 hours, vocal practice listening. She knew he'd spoken up for Harold. Because of that, her thanks to Ethan had to pass through Harold. Gratitude, if it's to be clean, needs a process. Late, she drafted a text to Harold. Just 3 words. I am sorry. She deleted it, typed, if you need me to log extra hours on the archive. Deleted. The dark screen showed a face no longer young. She set the phone down and said into the quiet, God knows. On Wednesday, she arrived early. A new cardboard box sat on the desk, sealed, no sender. Inside, the old choir director's book from the 90s, peacock blue cover, frayed edges, and a white scarf with an embroidered M. No note. A faint lavender scent. She laid the scarf across her palms, and it hurt. Memories have a way of arriving exactly when your guard is down. She locked the scarf in the bottom drawer. Not today, she whispered. If she opened it, she'd cry instead of work. Crying had become a luxury. That afternoon, the board emailed, Open data portal in test mode. Your name will appear under violation remedied, with community service hours attached. She read remedied again and again, both surrender and rebirth. A remedy doesn't erase a wound. It stitches it. If kept clean, stitches become scars. Scars aren't pretty. They are honest. That night she came home, switched off the lights, and sat in the dark for a long time. Then she unlocked the drawer, took out the white scarf, laid it over her shoulders. No mirror, no audience. She stood in the small room and sang, quietly, "Abide with me." Her voice was rough, breath short on beat 3, the beat she used to scold the altos for. She stopped and clicked her tongue at herself. "All right," she told the empty room. "Start again, from the beat." Outside, Franklin Lake held its breath. Somewhere, a clock struck 10. Margaret heard the chime not as a sentence, but as a schedule. Tomorrow, and the day after, and the days after that. There is no shortcut on the road back. It's a walking path. Step by step, breath by breath, beat by beat. Spring moved slower than usual. Franklin warmed, but for Margaret the air stayed as cold as an empty room. The rumors she thought the verdict had buried kept floating through the cafes around the church. No one said the offender. They said that woman, two small words heavy as stone. In Franklin, once you're just that woman, your name's been crossed out of the ledger. One morning she took a resume to the used bookstore on Main. The manager skimmed it and stopped at the line, "Court-ordered community service, Franklin." He looked up with a polite smile. "Sorry, the position's filled," but the "now hiring part-time" sign still hung in the window. Margaret nodded, didn't argue. Drizzle misted the street. The paper in her bag went damp. She stopped at the bakery near the library, greeted the owner who'd once made her a birthday loaf. The woman didn't turn. Her voice floated back, flat. "All sold out today." Margaret kept walking. She wasn't hungry. She just needed an excuse for someone to talk to her. That afternoon at the library, she caught a whisper behind her. "Watch your stuff, she's a criminal." Two young volunteers, voices low but aimed to land. Margaret turned and smiled. "You can lock your cabinets. My sins don't spread." The girls flushed and looked at their shoes. Margaret felt no anger, only a tender grief for the version of herself a year ago who might have gossiped like that, thinking it harmless. Now she knew. Small words can shove a weak person over the edge. That night Paul called from his office. His tone was sand dry. "The Morning Herald wants to revisit the case with a women's perspective. I advise silence, but if you want it, they'll pay triple." "You think I need money that badly?" "Everyone needs money," Paul said. "And you need to be remembered, not to win, so you don't disappear." She was quiet, then slowly. "I don't want to be remembered by my worst thing, and I don't want to explain, because explaining is just another way I'd lie to myself." She hung up. Thunder rolled its first notes of the season. She watched rain slide down the glass, streetlight turning drops to silver threads. In the rain she heard a knock that wasn't there, just the memory of the night Harold came home with the envelope. Every knock since then carries that heartbeat. 2 weeks later, the library took on local students for internship hours. Margaret was assigned to mentor them. The kids were loud, clumsy, clear-eyed. A girl named Clara whispered, "Miss Margaret, did you used to sing in the choir? My grandma says your voice was beautiful." "Who's your grandma?" "Grandma Ruth." The name stopped her. Ruth, the board chair, the one who'd banged the gavel and then avoided Margaret's eyes through the trial. Clara handed her a slip of paper. "Grandma says, ask Miss Margaret to teach me 'Abide with Me.' I want to sing it at Easter." Margaret studied the trembling paper, then nodded. "Okay, but slow. It's not a show-off song. It's a reminder that God stays, even when we don't deserve him." Clara smiled. That afternoon, as the girl sang the first lines, voice shaky, Margaret sat at the piano and laid in a light accompaniment. Her fingers were stiff, her timing imperfect, but the sound still rounded out. Each note was a stitch pulling torn threads together. After class, Clara hugged her. "I think God likes your voice." "If he still hears me," Margaret said, tears catching in the girl's hair, "he's probably crying with me." The next day, Ruth came to the library. She stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping in, coat dotted with rain, hair much grayer. "You may not want to see me," she said. "I may not deserve to," Margaret answered. They sat across from each other. Ruth pulled a faded photo from her bag. The 1995 choir. Margaret in the front row, Harold beside her. "I'm not taking this down for good," Ruth said. "I only put it away. When you sing again, I'll hang it back up." "You still think I can?" Margaret asked, stunned. "I don't know if you still have the voice," Ruth said. "I know you've learned the tempo. A choir needs a keeper of time more than a loud voice." The words lodged in Margaret's throat. She only nodded. After Ruth left, Margaret sat a long time looking at the photo. Afternoon light angled through the window, touching her younger face, proud, bright. She whispered, "I'll sing again, not for me, for the ones who believed the first time, and for the ones learning how to believe again." That night she turned on the radio. A short bulletin. Franklin Board opens volunteer Bible reading class for the blind. Former choir director Margaret Lewis to serve as instructor. The announcer read it plain, but that line warmed her, not for the mention, but because, for the first time in months, her name was attached to an action, not a charge. She reopened her repay by hours list. Under Ethan, 5 hours vocal practice, she added, Clara, 10 hours, learn the old hymn, hear the old stories. She smiled. Add hours if you must, just keep the beat. Outside, early summer drifted in, fresh grass and grill smoke from the lakeside. For the first time in months, Margaret opened the window. Moonlight slid across the floor, cool and warm at once, like a hand resting on the shoulder of someone who turned back. 3 months after the verdict, Franklin shifted seasons. Leaves by the lake began to yellow. Sunlight on the church softened, warm enough for someone to pause, breathe, and move on. Margaret kept to her rhythm at the library, and every Thursday she went to the Center for the Blind to read scripture. At first her voice trembled, not from fatigue, but fear. Fear of hearing herself read about forgiveness, justice, light. But the listeners didn't see her, they simply smiled. One old man said, "You read beautifully. Your voice sounds like it's been broken, which makes it true." For the first time in months, she laughed without shaking. "How do you know my voice was broken?" "Unbroken voices can't touch people," he said. The sentence washed her clean. She read slower, steadier. Some days she paused mid-verse, choked, but she wasn't ashamed. A voice that cracks and keeps going, that's proof of life. One evening, shelving, she found the old relief fund ledger, brown leather, thick with dust. On the first page, Harold's handwriting, "A fund isn't just money, it's trust. Whoever holds this book holds people's hearts." Her hands shook. She remembered the years he sat for hours at the old computer, balancing donations to the cent, then texting her, "Don't forget to prep Sunday's hymn." They had been partners in love and in faith, until she turned both into debt. She carried the ledger home and set it on the table. She wanted to return it, but didn't know how. Harold still came to church, different now, quieter, eyes down, always gone before the bell. On a foggy Saturday, she decided to try. She waited outside the nave while Harold set chairs for prayer. He didn't see her. He was thinner, grayer, but still precise in his movements. She walked in and placed the ledger on the table by the pulpit. He turned at the sound. His eyes went from the book to her face. No words. The floor's old wood creaked in small places. "I'm bringing back what I shouldn't have kept," she said. He looked at the ledger, then at her. "It doesn't belong to you or me," he said evenly. "It belongs to everyone. Thanks for keeping it safe." "I didn't keep it out of goodness," she said. "I kept it because I was afraid." "Sometimes fear is how God keeps us from running," he said. She went still. The simple line opened something wide inside her. "Do you hate me, Harold?" she asked. He shook his head. "Hate is what you hold only if you're still in love. What I feel now is tenderness." Silence stretched. A test bell rang from the tower, sound pouring into the empty space. They both turned toward the window where light pushed through the mist and broke into soft bands. "I've been reading scripture to the blind," she said. "They say my voice sounds cracked." "Cracked is honest," he answered. "If a glass has no crack, how does light settle into it when it's poured?" Her tears came, not of guilt, but of release. She had lived like someone buried in the dark, only to find the light never left. It was waiting for her to open her eyes. She took the white scarf from her pocket, the one someone had sent in the box. "I don't know who sent this. Maybe God wanted me to remember who I used to sing for." "Maybe," Harold said. "Will you sing again?" "Yes," she said. "But this time, on time." They stood without touching, looking toward the empty pews, where sunlight drew long lines like staff paper. That evening, Margaret finished her last community service shift. On the desk, she left a small handwritten sign. "I've been wrong, and I still want to help. If you need a reader, a cleaner, or just someone to sit and listen, knock." The manager found the sign next morning and couldn't bring himself to take it down. He framed it and hung it in the hallway with the caption, Margaret Lewis Wing, Scripture Reader for the Blind. Time did its slow work. Her name began to be spoken again, not as the one who failed, but as one who repaired. A year later at Christmas, Ruth found Harold. The choir's missing a timekeeper, she said. What do you think about inviting? Harold smiled. I think the bell rings truest when the person who once got it wrong is the one striking the hour. That night, Margaret returned to the small risers. She stood with the altos in a plain white robe, no spotlight. When Abide With Me rose, she closed her eyes and let her voice blend. Not loud, not shaky, just even, just true. Harold sat in the last pew. As the hymn lifted into the vault, he bowed his head and smiled, not because he had forgiven, because at last both of them had found the right beat for peace. Snow returned to Franklin in the days after Christmas, white, silent, cold. Like a baptism, God sent late for stained souls. Margaret sat by the library window with a cup of cold tea. Slanted morning light slid through the glass and lit the small leather notebook she carried everywhere. Inside, besides schedules for scripture readings, were letters she wrote to herself, messages she never sent. On the first page she dated it, January 5th. Then she wrote, No greeting, no dear. Every time I think I've been forgiven, I dream of you. You sit alone in the church, staring at the cross, and I stand behind the last pew, too afraid to come forward. I call your name, but you don't turn. I know it's not because you can't hear me, it's because you want me to say the thing I still haven't said. You say, Bob, Margaret, don't apologize with words. Live differently. I wake up feeling empty, but lighter. Maybe forgiveness doesn't come from someone else. Maybe it starts when I can look at myself without hating what I see. She set the pen down. Each night she dreamed again, and in those dreams the chaos had thinned. The church was lit. Voices rose. Harold stood still, not accusing. The only shadow left was the one inside her that hadn't stepped into the light. One Thursday evening, after reading scripture, she stayed to clean the center. The hallway lights had been dimmed. Her shadow stretched long. From the last room came a soft rhythm, like someone tapping time. She opened the door. Ethan sat at an old piano. He grinned. Didn't head home yet? Just wiping down a few things. You still here? Yeah, I teach music to the new recovery group. Paying it forward, I guess. She studied him, smiling, gentle and sad. I used to think I helped you, she said. But the truth is, you helped me. Me? He blinked. How? You learned to sing again. I learned to listen. He plucked a small chord, then asked softly, I taught them Amazing Grace tonight. Want to sing with me? She hesitated and nodded. She sat beside him and joined the melody, hoarse, tired, yet honest enough to warm the tone of the old piano. When they finished, Ethan turned. You know, he said, people who were truly lost sing Amazing Grace better than anyone, because they remember what it felt like to be found. She smiled. Walking home late, the line kept ringing in her mind. Because they remember what it felt like to be found, but some nights, regret still found its way back. Another dream, the courtroom again, but this time no one spoke. She stood in the center while everyone stared at the floor. Judge Daniels didn't read a verdict. He asked, Do you forgive yourself? She opened her mouth. No sound. Wind blew out every light. The gavel struck, loud as a heart sentencing itself. She woke with a chill, nightshirt damp with sweat. 3 a.m. Margaret switched on the lamp and opened her Bible. The pages fell to John 8:11. Neither do I condemn you. Go, and sin no more. She stared at the line a long time, and for the first time she cried because she felt forgiven, not because she felt guilty. No witness, none needed. Real forgiveness doesn't need an audience. It only needs one person brave enough to believe they still deserve to stand. The next day she stopped by the church. Harold was showing the kids how to polish the organ keys. She watched from the doorway, didn't go in. When he left, she set a small wooden cross on the table, carved with the words, Abide in Truth. On the back, she wrote the date she finished her service hours. That night, she opened the notebook and wrote one more letter, maybe the last. Harold, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I want to say it, even if I'm the only one who hears it. I spent half my life afraid of losing you, our name, our faith. Now I fear one thing, living without daring to believe in forgiveness. If you ever sing again, let me stand in the back and give you a count in, not to pay a debt, but to remember, once, we kept the same song. She folded the notebook, set it in the drawer, and locked it with the old key, Harold's key, the one that used to open the music room. The click sounded like the final period on a long confession. Outside, the wind still bit, but it no longer stung. It brushed past like a hand smoothing the shoulders of someone learning to breathe again. After that night, she didn't dream the courtroom anymore. No gavels. Instead, she dreamt of a church flooded with light, the choir singing, Harold turning to her and nodding once. No words, just that. And she knew real forgiveness had begun, from the inside out. February. The snow returned in heavy layers. Wind off the lake knifed the skin, but Margaret no longer felt cold. She sat by the window and watched flurries spin and vanish on the glass. Her body had weakened. The doctor said chronic anemia and an irregular heart. She smiled. My heart's been irregular a long time, doctor. She still went to the library and read to the blind, but slower now, losing lines here and there. One afternoon she reached, even though I walk through the valley of shadow, and paused, smiling. I'm walking in the dark right now, and it seems he really is walking with me. People glanced up, puzzled, but no one interrupted. Her voice, hoarse, thin, still made you bow your head. At night she dozed in fragments, her dreams braided with light and dark. She saw Harold in the front pew with the old Bible, snow falling outside, and herself singing, Abide with Me. There was no ending, only Harold lifting his head, nodding, and dissolving into a soft, misty glow. She woke with tears on the pillow. The tea on her table had cooled to silence. Her chest hurt more often now. Strangely, she wasn't afraid, only of one thing, leaving without saying enough. That evening, she took out the leather notebook and opened to a fresh page. This would be the last letter, not to beg, not to explain, to end her story with the clearest truth she owned. Harold, if you're reading this, it means I've gone farther than a body can walk. I don't know where I'm headed, but if God is merciful, He'll let me sing one more hymn until the breath runs out. You once said, faith dies from lies. I've learned faith only dies if we stop trying to bring it back to life. I won't ask you to forgive me. I believe you did, long ago. I only want you to know I've learned to forgive myself. Each morning I look in the mirror and no longer see a traitor. I see someone paying what she owes, not with tears, but with hours, with a reading voice, with every slow, honest breath. If someday you hear someone reading scripture with a rough voice, don't look for me. Just smile, knowing I'm exactly where I'm meant to be, inside the sound of forgiveness. She tied the notebook with a white ribbon and set it on the shelf where Harold had once left the small wooden cross. Next to it she laid the white scarf, clean and lavender-scented. On a scrap of paper she wrote quickly, For the one who taught me to keep time. Morning turned the town to white. She still went to the library, sat a while, then told the manager, I'm a bit tired. I'll head home early. On the way, she stopped at the church. The bell struck 9. Sound fell onto the snow like metal on glass. She lifted her face to the cross. Thank you, she whispered, for letting me break, so I could learn I can still be made whole. She slipped inside and sat in the last pew. The sanctuary was empty. Light passed through stained glass, laying blue, red, and gold across the floor, like a painting of mercy. A figure entered. Harold. He started toward the front, then paused when he saw her. I'm only stopping by, she said, smiling. You all right? He asked. Better than ever. They didn't say more. They sat in the quiet together. After a time, Margaret breathed. You know, forgiveness doesn't come at the end. It comes the moment we admit we don't deserve it. Harold's eyes softened. Then, you've received it. She bowed her head and prayed. When she looked up, window light turned her face luminous, fine as porcelain. Harold would remember her that way. A woman who had done wrong, sitting in light without trembling. 3 days later they found Margaret in the chair by her sister's window, as if still reading, a cold cup of tea in her hands. On the table lay the leather notebook, opened, the pen tip still wet, the last sentence unfinished. Maybe forgiveness doesn't really need 2 people. It only needs one person willing to become light again. Word of her passing spread, quietly. The church held a small memorial. No wreaths, no speeches. Harold prayed in a steady baritone, "Lord, receive Margaret's soul. She fell, she rose, and she learned to sing on the beat." The choir sang "Abide with Me," her favorite. There was an empty spot in the altos. Ruth laid the white scarf with the stitched M across that chair. When the hymn ended, Harold looked up into the vault. A ray of sun came through the stained glass and landed squarely on the scarf, making it shine. "You're singing again, Margaret," he whispered, "where the light never goes out." That night, Harold opened the old bookcase. Tucked between Bibles and files sat a small box sent from the library. Inside were the leather notebook and the note she'd left, "For the one who taught me to keep time." He turned to the last page, saw the unfinished line, and smiled. He picked up a pen and wrote the rest. "So others can look and remember that even light had to pass through darkness to grow gentler." He set the pen down and closed the book. No tears. Only a peace so deep it was quiet. Outside, snow blanketed Franklin Lake, and through the white the church bell rang, round even, perfectly on time. The funeral was as quiet as Margaret had wished. No flowers, no black clothing, just light. Harold stood in the last pew, fingers laced, head slightly bowed. On the altar lay the white scarf that had stayed with her through those final months. There were no speeches, only a small choir singing "Abide with Me." When the last phrase faded, Franklin's bell rang, round and even, as if God himself were closing the chapter of a soul that had endured enough. After the service, Harold locked up the house they'd shared for more than half a century, then unlocked it and left the door as it was. Everything remained. The cracked porcelain teacup, the cross on the wall, the robe she'd folded just so. He set the leather notebook, her last gift, on the table and walked away without a key. Nothing left to lose, nothing left to keep, he thought. 3 weeks later, he set out on his first trip since retiring. No itinerary, just a list. The people the Franklin Relief Fund had once helped. He rented a small car and loaded a few boxes, worn Bibles, Margaret's scribbled notes, a photo of the two of them in front of the church on an old Easter morning. First stop, Littleton, where an elderly woman named Martha Doyle had received help to fix her roof after a storm. She was past 80 now, in a wheelchair living with her granddaughter. When she saw Harold, she smiled. The dim eyes still knew him. "Oh, Mr. Harold, and where's Margaret?" He answered softly, "She's gone home to God." Martha's hand shook in his. "She was a good one. Back then I refused the money for the roof, but she kept saying, 'We're just paying back what faith lent us.'" The old woman chuckled, voice ragged. "I suppose she's debt-free now?" Harold sat beside her and said nothing, looking up at the roof, new paint catching the sun. He could see Margaret there in his mind, sleeves rolled, calling out colors to the young painters, a woman who believed every patched roof was a small piece of grace. When he left, Martha gripped his hand hard. "If you meet her somewhere," she said, "tell her the house still stands, and so does my heart." Harold nodded. It was the first time he had truly smiled since the funeral. Next, he drove to Riverbend, where the fund had once supported a class for at-risk teens. In a chapel carved out of an old warehouse, he met Lucas, the boy once convicted of petty theft, now a job training coach. "I thought you'd retired for good," Lucas said, surprised. "You still remember me?" "I remember all of you," Harold said. "And the thank you letter you wrote to Margaret." Lucas lowered his gaze. "I never got a reply." Harold smiled, bittersweet. "She read it. She said, 'He'll do something good if someone believes in him again.' And she did." Lucas was quiet a long time. "I didn't know she'd passed," he said at last. "If there's another life, I hope she knows I didn't waste it." Harold left Riverbend at a blaze of sunset, the reeds along the highway bowing in the wind. The photo of Margaret, clipped to the visor, trembled with the car. In the slanting light, he spoke under his breath. "You see, don't you? They still remember. Even with what went wrong, your kindness stayed." The wind answered in a long hush. Harold smiled. He knew it wasn't only the wind. It was the echo of the dead, singing back in another key. Harold's journey lasted 2 months. He drove through the South, small towns where people still knew each other's names, and every church had its own bell. Everywhere he went, someone remembered Margaret, not as the woman who failed, but as the woman who helped them stand. In Belford, he visited the recovery center where Ethan now ran a program called Reconciliation Hope. Ethan came running, hugged him hard, sun-browned, eyes bright. "I knew you'd come," he said. "She must have told you to." "How would she tell me?" Ethan grinned. "She sent me a letter 2 weeks before she died. Said, if Harold shows up, don't offer condolences. Show him what forgiveness looks like." "Looks like?" Harold asked. Ethan led him to a small display room, shelves of crafts made by men from the prison program, frames, rosaries, crosses. In the center stood a large wooden cross, carved with "Abide in Truth." The wood was scarred and rough, burnished smooth where hands had touched it most. "It's from an old Franklin cell door," Ethan said, voice husky. The carver was a man the fund sponsored for trade school. He lost his mother to addiction. He said, "If anyone believes in me again, I'll carve a cross with the same hands that did wrong." Harold stood still, feeling a shape inside him he couldn't name. "He wants you to have it," Ethan said. "He calls it the gift of a whole forgiveness." "Whole?" Harold asked softly. "Because it's made from sin, but it isn't sin anymore." Harold placed his palm on the wood, cold, rough, true. He saw Margaret in court, head bowed. He saw her later, calm, saying the last words, "I only wanted to protect him." Now he understood. She'd meant not only him, but this little world of the frail, trying to buy back trust. "Keep it here," Harold said. "Don't bring it to the church." Ethan blinked. "Why not?" "Forgiveness isn't meant to hang out of reach," Harold said. "It's meant to be touched." That night he slept at the center. When the building settled and the lights went low, he sat under a maple and looked up into a star-punched sky. In his pocket was Margaret's fragment, the unfinished line he could recite by heart. A breeze moved through the doorframe, sounding like a hymn without words. It wasn't his imagination. The prison choir was practicing late, torn voices, warm and true. "You hear it, Margaret?" he whispered. "Our song still carries, not perfect, honest. And that's what God wanted." Moonlight fell across the carved letters, "Abide in Truth," while a quiet smile found its way onto the face of a man who had crossed anger and loss and come out with gratitude. "Thank you for being wrong," he murmured. "Because of that, I learned how to love without needing to be right." In the morning, Ethan walked him out. At the car, Harold rested a hand on his shoulder. "When you help someone, remember, none of us really saves anybody. We just remind them they're worth saving." Ethan's eyes shone. "I know. Thank you. And thank her." The car rolled away, sunrise washing the big wooden cross. In the rear view, light broke over the grain, like light loosening something inside him. He realized he wasn't traveling to find anything anymore. He was traveling to set the last piece of regret down and call it forgiveness. 3 months later, Harold came home to Franklin, and the church was the same, settled among old maples. The lake was a mirror for the evening sky. One thing had changed. In him, anger was gone. He parked at the curb, still holding the leather notebook and Margaret's unfinished line. Autumn air smelled of wet grass with a faint lift of lavender, like her scarf. Inside, a handful of voices rehearsed. Alto, soprano, tenor, awkward in places, earnest everywhere. Harold slipped into the last pew, where Margaret had sat near the end. Light poured through stained glass, painting his face in violet and blue. When they paused, he stepped forward. The room quieted. He spoke slowly, every word hauled up from the deepest part of him. "I've traveled a while, met people Margaret helped, people we stood with, and people who judged her. I learned something. None of them is perfect, but each carries a sliver of forgiveness's light. We weren't made to be faultless. We were made to repair what we break, with kindness. I used to think justice meant winning. Now I know justice is when the truth doesn't require anyone to lose." He looked around the sanctuary that had seen both their belief and their sin. "She taught me one last lesson. Faith doesn't die from lies. It dies when we stop believing someone can become good again, and family isn't blood. It's how we treat each other when everything falls apart." Wind threaded the door jambs, tinkling a faint chorus of bells. He lifted his eyes to the cross. A thin shaft of light stitched heaven to the floor. "Margaret," he said quietly to the air, "you've finished your part. It's my turn to keep time. I won't sing loud. I won't beg. I'll live, on the beat of forgiveness." He bowed his head for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet but no longer sad. A boy from the choir jogged over and offered a hymnal. "Sir, would you sing with us?" Harold smiled. "Of course." But slower this time, so we can hear our hearts catch the rhythm. They took Abide With Me from the top. The sound drifted out across Franklin Lake, touching rooftops and old streets he and Margaret had once walked. No one knew whether it was rehearsal or a service. People stopped anyway, because something in it felt like peace. When the hymn ended, Harold stepped into the porch light. Sun pooled over his shoulders. He looked toward the lake and whispered, "Family isn't blood. It's regard and love. It's choosing to lift someone when they fall, even if they once hurt you. It's knowing forgiveness isn't weakness. It's courage. The courage to believe a human heart can mend." He paused, smiling. "If anyone asks what faith is, I'll say this. Faith is believing a voice that once lost the beat can find its way back into harmony." Franklin's bell answered. Round, even, right on time, like the heart of a man who'd finally found rest after a lifetime of wandering. Harold turned away, gripping the leather notebook, Margaret's last relic. He knew that though she was gone, their story kept moving. Through every person forgiven, in every breath their faith still drew. If you've been hurt, lost faith, or failed and think you don't deserve love, remember, faith doesn't live in a building. It lives in your chest. Stay. Keep listening. Because the next story I tell will prove it again. Even the most shattered souls can learn to sing.